Okay, this is the video lecture for Chapter 2 in State and Local Government. Here we're going to be talking about federalism, but before we do that, we're going to have to review a little bit and talk about the U.S. Constitution, particularly in what the Constitution does to delegate powers down to the states. Now, we won't be able to spend as much time on this as I would in other classes as to why we have a Constitution, because the Constitution didn't come around until about 11 years after our Declaration of Independence. What was the biggest issue here was that the Articles of Confederation pretty much gave all the 13 states their own sovereign power for the most part. So therefore, the United States central government did not have a whole lot of power over what each of these individual states wanted to do. So they were kind of pursuing their own interests, as you could logically assume there. And there was lots of things going on. First of all, there was a recession, which is not unusual when you make a big transition like that, particularly from the barter system that we were in with the United Kingdom. And then when that barter system went away, farmers had to pay their bills with currency, and so there was some economic problems, particularly for the working men, the farmers, former veterans of the Revolutionary War. We also see that states were kind of developing their own little power structures. We see that some states were passing tariffs against other states. That's where those are taxes on imports from other states within our own 13 original colonies there. Some states were making their own currencies, and that creates a lot of disparity between states, competition between states. And perhaps one of the most potentially problematic things was that some states were pursuing treaties with other countries. So you could imagine if New York aligned with Great Britain and Virginia aligned with France, for example, you could have a war that could break the United States up fairly quickly. So a lot of stuff was happening, and even George Washington was very concerned about what was going on, and felt like, along with James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, that a stronger central government was needed in order to keep the states together. The Shays' Rebellion was the incident that probably was the last straw that inspired the Constitutional Convention. Daniel Shays was a former veteran in the war who became a farmer in Massachusetts and was having lots of problems. He had gotten put in jail owing a debt. He formed a group of men who were pushing back against the powerful state structures there, and it grew. And so the Massachusetts militia, as well as some federal government troops that they were able to amass, were trying to prevent them from taking over an arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, and it broke out into some, basically the cannons were fired into the Shays insurgents there, and 4 of them were killed immediately, and they scattered. But the damage was done because we see that these potential uprisings were could occur again across several other states. So James Madison kind of took up the lead on this and literally called. Now we can get to a lot more detail on this, but we're trying to get to the point to where the Constitution is written, and we're trying to figure out how did they delegate power down to the states. Now, clearly the main reason for getting together was to get the states all together on the same page to form a more perfect union, and we wanted to create a representative republic because there was concern with people becoming mob rule, so-called tyranny of the majority. So we created a representative republic. Also, by getting all the states together, Alexander Hamilton was really kind of foresightful on this. He was also our very first Secretary of Treasury. And he felt that if all these 13 states could get their economic act together as the United States of American economy, we would be on par with Great Britain as an economic power. And he was correct. It took a while, but that's eventually what happened. Now, they created a representative public. So what that means is that we've got districts that each person is elected from a district, and the states are broken up into districts based on their population. And in addition to that, they kept the states as they were. So that's what we call federalism. We have a central government that's operating separately from the state governments. But it was an interesting mix there. We've got representatives coming from the districts. We've also got senators, 2 senators coming from each state, and that's what made up federal government, as well as the powers that are delegated back down to the states. And one of the things that they were wary of course, since the main motivation was to create a stronger central government, they also did not want a central government that was too strong, because they needed to get this ratified. And if it was too strong, the states would push back and not ratify it. So one of the things they also did was create the 3 branches of government: the legislative branch, judicial branch, and the executive branch, that kind of worked off of each other, checks and balances. And so it was a fairly complex system, but it worked, and it became a model, an example for the rest of the world, even to this day. So just let's go through. Now, I've posted a copy of the Constitution on Moodle, and you can Google it and find many copies. So look at that. Of course, I also want to read that as well. But what I'm going to focus on is the portions of the Constitution that really kind of delineated what the states were going to do, even though the federal government is the central government and has supreme power. There's lots of things that the states are delegated to do because it's going to be a big, populated, diverse country. So in Article 1, we've already talked about this. The states set up their districts and they elect representatives that go to U.S. Congress. They also choose 2 senators per state. 17th Amendment, which came along around 1913, shifted that a little bit to where each state holds a popular election, whereas initially the state legislature just chose those 2. Also, the very important delegation here, we'll talk about this more later because elections is a very important part of the course. States were delegated to determine how they were going to hold these elections. And so that's why each state is responsible for determining who voted for president, who voted for their representative, who voted for their senator, and then they come to Washington. And then Section 9 of Article 1 just talks about a few basic restrictions on federal power. These are some individual rights such as habeas corpus, which means you have the right to be brought before the court and speak to the judge and defend yourself, things like that. Also, Section 10 of Article 1 puts some restrictions on the states. They cannot create their own currencies. That was a big problem. They can't pass tariffs against each other. Can't do that. A state cannot negotiate treaties with other countries, nor can states enter into agreements with each other unless it's approved by Congress. And this is called the Interstate Compact Clause. And one of the many examples of an interstate compact is the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, which New York, New Jersey have agreed on how to handle the bridge and tunnel facilities and traffic and things like that. Article 2 is talking about the executive branch. So the first thing they're dealing with here is how to elect the president. So each state chooses electors, and they go to the electoral college to cast their vote for the president. Now, this is fairly controversial and a lot more complicated than we're going to be able to get into in this course. We'll deal with that with another class, but that's the states are still responsible for determining who they are going to vote for as president. Article 3, another important delegation here is that all criminal trials will be held in the state where that crime was committed. So the judicial system is also split up between federal government that handles public law, constitutional law, and then state courts, which are handling the criminal and civil trials they're in their state. So the overwhelming majority of trials in the United States are held in state courts. Article 4 was the article that was trying to get all the states together, and the full faith and credit clause, as well as privileges and immunities clause here. That just means that if there's an official act or an official proceeding or record that is recognized that somebody achieves in some state, well, then that's recognized in another state. So, for example, being married in one state, if you move to another state, that other state also recognizes that you're married. Now, they also guaranteed a representative form of government there. Article 5 was just the process for making amendments, and what's important here is that once the U.S. Congress approves that amendment, which is a 2/3 vote in both houses, it then has to go out and get approved by 3/4 of all the states. That would be 38 states have to approve that amendment before it gets put in the Constitution. And so this obviously has not happened very often since the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. Those are the first 10 amendments. Well, we've only had 17 amendments in that entire period since then, since 1791. Now, the states also have to recognize supremacy. We'll talk about some push and pull on that. Bottom line is that federal government, U.S. Congress has final say on passing law. U.S. Supreme Court has final say on interpreting the law. And, of course, the Constitution has to be ratified by 9 states. And it was ratified relatively quickly in today's terms. It was ratified by mid-1788. Now, one of the things that, in order to get it approved, the framers realized that they're going to have to give the states a few more assurances. And that was where they decided to add the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And these are a more specific list of individual rights or guarantees or protections that the federal government gives to people or the states. And there were some anti-federalists that were not too crazy about this federal layer of government that was going to be over and above their state government, because they were very much attuned to amassing their own state power and not having to really report to anyone else. So they really weren't happy about another layer of government that they would report to. So the anti-federalists were appeased through the Bill of Rights as well as the Federalist Papers, which more clearly articulated the reasoning behind the Constitution. So we're seeing a little bit more restrictive boundaries on national government in order to help get the Constitution ratified, and it did. Now, one of the most important of those 10 amendments is the 10th Amendment, and it's a very short and sweet. You can read it for yourself, but that's called the 10th Amendment. One sentence is called the Reserved Powers Clause, and it packs a punch. It says that any powers that are not delegated to the federal government are therefore reserved to the states. So that literally means that whatever we do not mention here, or what could potentially be passed by federal government, states take care of that. And over the course of our history, these reserved powers have been categorized in 3 basic categories. Police power, which we're looking at all the criminal codes, health and safety regulations of the state. Each state is responsible for figuring that out because that's where the crimes are going to be committed. So the state has to figure out what their criminal laws are. There's also some concurrent powers, which concurrent just means that the state is doing these powers kind of parallel with the federal government, and most of this has to do with regulating commerce of the state. Since the federal government regulates commerce of the entire United States, the state government would regulate commerce within the state. So that's called concurrent powers. And another of these reserved powers has been called home rule, where each state is responsible for setting up their own government structure. And what we've seen over the years is that every state has pretty much copied the federal model. Virtually every single state does have the same three branches of government. And so there's very consistent similarities with all 50 states as far as their basic structure of their governments. Now, let's talk a little bit more about this concept of federalism, which is the definition of which is that you've got a national government operating separately from state governments, and unitary types of governments, well, typically means that you don't really have that separation, that all power is in the central government, such as Sweden, for example. Smaller countries, the majority of countries have a unitary system, not broken up into states or provinces or the various names that are used for those sections in other countries. A confederacy is another form where the state regions are given more autonomy and power. And just to be clear here, there's really no confederacies that are still remaining in the world. Switzerland kind of considers itself a confederacy, but still very small, kind of independent country there. And then in between we have the federal systems, such as the United States, and this is where we have the two separate layers operating, and the national government is delegating things down to the state governments and letting them operate somewhat autonomously, whereas the national government, of course, has final supremacy. And there's only about 21 federal systems in the world, but these are the bigger countries. The countries with larger territory and larger populations, it just makes more sense to break them up into these federal systems where you have state or regional governments that can divide the area up, and then of course they all report to the central federal government. So we've talked about these here delegated powers in the Constitution. We've talked about the 10th Amendment with the reserved powers broken up into three categories here. Very early on, within about a decade, Congress passed the 11th Amendment, which also gave states immunity from being sued, particularly by somebody from another country or from somebody by another state. So that is just kind of giving states a little bit more protection from outside interference. So that was part of our progression here of the 11th Amendment, fairly obscure amendment, but it does give states a little bit more power. Now this chart is in the book, and this shows the breakdown of the powers, and the concurrent powers here, the overlapping part that I talked about. So states can have the power to tax its people, much like the central government does. They can borrow money, but they have to pay it back in the not as sustaining a deficit. So a little bit more complicated there. They can do other things like chartering banks and licensing corporations. They can also have the power of eminent domain in each state. State can take property as long as they compensate fair market value. So those are some of the examples of concurrent powers there. Now, some detail here as far as the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution. And what Article 1 spells out in Section 8 are the expressed powers. and that includes the General Welfare Clause, that Congress can pass laws that they think are in the general welfare of the United States. They also can regulate commerce between states. And here is a fairly vague one, that's why it's called implied powers, also in Section 8, is that Congress can pass laws that they think are necessary and proper. So that's a pretty big power. Congress could literally go in there and pass a law that they think is needed for the United States. And then, of course, in Article 6, they lay it out very clear that the U.S. Constitution, federal government, is the supreme law of the land. So even though they give states a lot of autonomy and independence to handle their own business, well, if there's a dispute or if something needs to be resolved or unified, then it goes all the way up to the federal government to have the final say on that. And we'll get into some of the problematic elements with federalism here in a minute, because the federal government seems to be fairly non-productive in trying to tackle issues. So therefore, states are kind of handling it on their own. Some other things that the federal government did, the 14th Amendment is very important because that is the Equal Protection Clause. The 14th Amendment was passed right after the Civil War, and it was meant to express that no state can deprive any citizen of due process of law. And so that is a very important clause in the Constitution that even to this day, cases will go all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will rule that state did not provide equal protection under the law. In 1913, the federal government passed the income tax, and prior to that, the biggest source of revenue for federal government was tariffs. And as we become an industrial power, tariffs start to come down. So they needed some way to increase revenue, plus federal government was being tasked to do more things, particularly in support of the Industrial Revolution. So that gave central government a little bit more power. 19th Amendment, they allowed women the right to vote. In 1964, the federal government abolished the poll tax, which a lot of states were enacting. It basically just flat out discriminating against poor people, of course, majority of which were minorities and former slaves, well, as we get into the 20th century there. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later, is how the federal government kind of over a long period of time had to incrementally enforce the states to come back in and comply with the Federal Bill of Rights. So for unity, we have the interstate cooperation that kept everybody on the same page. We have each state recognizing the acts and the proceedings and other official documents of other states. There's also a clause in there that says that if someone commits a crime in one state and they flee to another state, extradition means that state has to bring them back to the state where that crime was committed. Privileges and immunities, same thing. Whatever is allowed in one state needs to be allowed in another state. Clearly, there's some exceptions here or there that we can get into as we get into the class, but these are the general provisions for unity. Here's some rulings that also, first of all, this is why it's a continual tug-of-war with federalism. In 1816, the Supreme Court ruled that it can review the state court's decisions. Now, the primary reason for this is so that we don't have 50 different versions of the U.S. Constitution, with every state Supreme Court, interpreting the U.S. Constitution as they see fit. Well, we need to keep everybody on the same page on that. So therefore, if there's any appeals that go beyond that, the U.S. Federal Supreme Court has final say on that ruling. Another case here gave federal government right to establish a national bank, and another one here, national authority over interstate commerce. So in the early 1800s, there were a few cases that reinforced the idea that, yes, the federal government is the supreme law of the land. But then we start to see, particularly as we get closer and closer to the modern era, states start kind of pushing back here and there. We see the this particular case in '76 favored the state governments to regulate minimum wage, but yet just a few years later they reversed that so that the federal government could establish a minimum wage, or at least a a minimum wage that all the states can't go below. So, and that's still an issue today because we're looking at some states raising it up to $15 an hour when the federal minimum wage is still technically at $7.25. An Obama executive order raised it to $8.25 for federal employees and associated contractors. So that's a pretty big jump. Then in '95, we're kind of getting into the era where the federal government is allowing the states more power on their own. And so here's a case where the federal government's School Zones Act was found unconstitutional, which gave power back to the states to figure out their own gun restrictions or whatever. Now, quick little history lesson here. Our federalism is ebbed and flowed. It's shifted. We've got some primary eras here of federalism that we'll touch on. The first era was all the way from our initial framing of the Constitution to 1932, and that was dual federalism. And then we had a period here from the 30s to the 60s called cooperative federalism, inspired primarily by the Depression. And then the federal government got a little bit more intrusive as we get into the 60s and 70s. That's called regulated or creative federalism. And then as a result of this and lots of other things that were happening in the 70s, there was some pushback, and even the federal government was amenable to letting the states have more power. So from the late 80s to the early 2000s, we have what was called the New Federalism. So let's look at those. The dual federalist period was where the national and state governments were operating more separately. The national government was really trying to stay out of the state's business, operating kind of like a layer cake. Other than the occasional ruling, they really tried to stay out of the state's business. Of course, now the Civil War, major hiccup there. We also see that this was reinforced in 1833 with a decision that pretty much enforced the idea of dual citizenship, where state citizenship was separate from federal citizenship. Now that no longer applies. We'll touch on that briefly, but it took about 100 years or more for that concept of dual citizenship to kind of get chipped away to where nowadays we don't even think of that. We don't think of ourselves as citizens of New Jersey and the United States. We just think of ourselves as United States citizens. And the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision really kind of supported the discrimination that the states were doing, because as we get further and further beyond the Civil War, Reconstruction period is ended, and states, particularly in the South, are really trampling on the civil rights of former slaves, blacks, and minorities. And this Supreme Court decision actually enforced the idea or supported the idea of separate but equal, which literally legalized segregation. So as we get into the 20th century, we see that the states are operating quite separately from federal government. But that all came to a big shift with the Great Depression. The economy collapsed. Franklin Roosevelt was elected based on his New Deal policy, which would increase federal government intervention, particularly to try to get the economy back on track. So what the New Deal policies were trying to do, and so as we see, we're shifting into this era now of cooperative federalism, to where now the federal government is no longer operating separately. They are now trying to influence states for national purposes and getting more involved in the interstate commerce between states. they're offering conditional grants, which means that we'll give you this money on the condition that you do what we want you to do. That's so that they could get all the states on the same page in order to try to get the economy back on track. They also had what were called matching grants, where we'll give you 90% of the money if you provide 10% of the money. And for example, the U.S. Federal, well, I guess I should say the interstate highway system is an example of one of these matching grants where the federal government provided, this was in the late 50s, federal government provided 90% of the funding to build the interstate highway system through that state, and the state provided 10% of the funds of what it required to go through that state. Also, during this period of the New Deal, during the Depression, the Social Security system was implemented, the unemployment insurance was implemented. These are all things to try to help people that were being hurt by the Depression. So as we get into World War II, government even steps up its involvement even more in order to try to win the World War II. After that victory, we see that there was a very a synergistic confluence of events that as we get in the post-World War II period, we see an economic boom that was called the Golden Age of Capitalism. We saw people increasing their standards of living, consumerism increasing tremendously. So the economy was booming as we get into the 60s. And also, as we become a more prosperous economy, we start thinking about other things. That, okay, well, why do we still have poverty? Why do we still have racial discrimination? Why are we messing up our environment? How come women still don't have equal rights? So as we get into the 1960s, the federal government gets even more creative in intervening into the states. And so that's why it's called regulated federalism, because now the federal government is actually stepping up and increasing its involvement into the state's business. And they're actually getting the states to conform to national standards in order to deal with these issues of the environment, pollution, poverty, the Vietnam War, the Cold War. Civil rights was really starting to become a very prominent issue as we get into the 60s. So government spending increases in order to do this. Now, this is something that a very prosperous society kind of collectively agrees on, that if we are very prosperous and everybody, or in general, we're doing pretty well, why do we still have these problems? So that's where the concept of the welfare state started to come into play, so that we could help people that are not benefiting, helping elderly, trying to alleviate pollution and poverty, and also fight for capitalism as opposed to communism, things like that. So during this period is when the Medicare program and the Medicaid program were also implemented. And also during this period, the Supreme Court was a relatively activist Supreme Court, into where it really eliminated this idea of dual citizenship. So the 1960s was very prolific in creating, for example, the Miranda rulings, the right to counsel, and if you can't afford one, the state will provide one for you, as well as the exclusionary rule, where not only do you have to have a proper warrant to make these searches and seizures, well, if you don't have one, then that evidence could get excluded from court. So the 60s was very active, and as we get into the 70s, however, we start to see the welfare state starting to weaken a little bit, because the Vietnam War was expensive. These programs need to be paid for, but the economy also starts to slow down as well. That golden age of capitalism is starting to play out. When everybody has a TV set and everybody has a refrigerator, well, obviously consumerism is going to slow down. And so we started to see in the 1970s quite a bit of financial problems. We also saw the oil shocks. We also saw the Watergate scandal. We saw rampant inflation. So the 70s was quite tumultuous, both economically as well as with civil society. And so as we get into the 1980s, there's a backlash to this federal government intervention. And Ronald Reagan was actually elected on the platform to get the federal government a little bit more out of the state's business. So we saw a conservative leaning administration that was acceptable to delegating more power back down to the states. And so that's where we enter this era of what is called new federalism, to where the states are given a little bit more power. The unfunded mandates, those were literally determined unacceptable by the states. An unfunded mandate simply means that the federal government is requiring the state to do a program, but they're not giving them any money to do it. So the state, it's a double whammy there. The state is required to create this new program, but then they have to come up with the funding for it. So that was another sore spot during the previous regulated federalist era. So now pushback, we're starting to see things like block grants, where states are still given the federal money, but now they have more discretion, more leverage on how to spend that money as they best see fit. So this is the concept of devolution during this new federalist era. The federal government is actually delegating more or devolving more programs down from federal power and then letting the states take care of more of their business. So as you can see, we are just shifting quite interestingly back and forth throughout our history. And then as we see, this is the textbook actually talks about our current era. We've actually shifted back, and it's a little bit more of an interesting mix today. But the book questions whether or not we're in more of a coercive federalist era now, primarily because of 9/11. The federal government got very much involved in trying to stop terrorism. We got into two wars, neither of which, well, again, you could say they had mixed results, but obviously it increased federal power to get us involved in these wars in order to fight terrorism in Afghanistan, in Iraq. In Iraq was kind of literally it was shifting a little bit from terrorism in order to get rid of Saddam Hussein. So the agenda actually got shifted a little bit, which also created some pushback there. And we also see, as we get into the 2000s, the corporate interests start to push back, and lobbying on federal government really started to accelerate. We'll talk more about that later. But the less regulated economy also then contributed to a great recession of 2008. But then, as a result of that recession, federal government also picks back up. We had bailouts in order to try to shore up the economy. The federal government provides stimulus programs, which provides ways of injecting money out into the system in order that people will have money to spend. We also saw that the Obama administration was elected in order to reform health care. So that was another big federal program, and also had some state objection to that for spending on Medicare. And Supreme Court actually struck down a portion of that Affordable Care Act. So you could argue we're in a somewhat of an interesting era right now, particularly under the current Trump administration. He will advocate for federal power on things like immigration, giving states more power to handle things like gun control. So, kind of a mixed bag. We'll talk about more and more examples as we go. Here are some examples of grants that we've already talked about. As far as how much funds that the federal government gives to states, well, it's only 4% of GDP, but since GDP is huge, that is quite a bit of money. We'll look at a pie chart here in a minute. Figure 2.3 in the book is this same chart that I'll be looking at that shows the breakdown of those federal funds that are actually given to the states. So the federally funded portion of state and local revenues is about 31%. of the federal government's annual budget. So that means the federal government is providing a lot of expense for the states to handle these programs such as Medicaid and unemployment and things like that. And we also will look at another chart here is that they're not spread evenly between states. And we also see that the federal government is also responsible for all the expenditures on Social Security, as well as most of the expenditures on Medicaid, things like that. We'll look as we get further on into the economy. We'll look at some of these numbers in more detail. Here's the portion that the federal government aid goes back down to state and local governments. As you can see, almost half of it is for health care. So that's things like Medicare, Medicaid, and subsidies for people that qualify for health insurance, those sort of things. These are the breakdowns of what some of the other money is spent on by states that the federal government provides them a lot of dollars to help do that. We also have the possibility that states could turn down a grant if they do not want to comply with conditions, and that was the Medicaid thing. The states, in order to get that Medicaid money, they actually had to expand their Medicaid coverage. Some states rebelled against that, and that's how it got all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck down that qualification. And we still have federal mandates, but there is a condition of funding that has to go with that because, as I mentioned before, during our new federalism era, this Unfunded Mandate Reform Act actually limits the amount that the federal government can impose on a state, particularly when it's going to require the state funds to do these things. And so this concept of total or partial preemption prevents states from doing just whatever they want. We still have to have some sort of national direction. That's what the federal government and the president's agenda, Congress legislates, things like that. Now, as far as the basic advantages of federalism, we see that particularly in a big, diverse country like that, there's lots of problems that could be best solved on the local level, even at the city level. And so what we're seeing here is that dispersal of power might be a more effective management of conflict rather than trying to centralize it all in one central government, particularly when you have such a large, diverse country with such a huge economy. And we also call this federalism concept laboratories of democracy, where each state can innovate. And we mentioned that in the first chapter, is that each state can come up with their own ideas on how to handle problems, and then that can diffuse to other states. And by spreading out these power structures, that increases political participation. Now, what we'll talk about later on is that the voter turnout on state and local elections is dismally low. And it's when it comes to the presidential election, which everybody knows about, it's only about 55% voter turnout there. So we'll get into that. Now, as far as the disadvantages of federalism, we still have coordination problems, particularly if it's a national issue that the federal government really needs to resolve. And we still have this state versus federal pushback, pullback, tug of war. Still, it's part of the process. And sometimes it could be counterproductive when it would be more efficient to centralize it. So that's what we have to decide on a case-by-case basis. We also see that if the states are delaying something, that it might be preventing the national government from acting. We also have to deal with the concept of local biases that might not suit a federal solution. We also see that if states are duplicating, this is actually a major cost of healthcare, is that each state or each system has its own administrative costs, where if you centralize that, you could trim quite a bit of cost just on administrative handling of it. And of course, we also see, and we'll touch on this throughout the course, that every state has different laws for different things. There's quite a bit of consistency, but there's also um, a lack of uniformity from state to state. And we also see that because each state has its own power structure, that lobbying is actually increasing at the state level. It's already huge at the federal level. So now we've got lobbying also, which is spending by corporate interests in order to influence state and local laws. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail. Okay, so this is chapters a little bit longer than average, but this is our chapter on federalism. So the next chapter we'll get into is looking at state constitutions.